So now that we have our pattern done, we understand about grain, we're ready to actually get some stuff done. So I'm gonna take my fabric here. Now I've actually got it doubled over 2 layers. I need to explain right side and wrong side. Right side is going to be the side of the fabric you want to see when the doll's wearing the garment or when you're wearing the garment. Typically the wrong side is going to be the inside or unprinted side in the case of a printed fabric where it's not a woven. Some fabrics don't have a right side or a wrong side. Things like homespuns, certain plaids. Some of your solids may not have a right side or wrong side. But just kind of decide which one you think is the best side. And I say right side and wrong side, not print side and blank side, because sometimes you may decide that the wrong side is the side you like better. The reason you want to know your right side and wrong side is because a lot of your patterns will have instructions and they'll actually tell you put right sides together or layer right side to wrong side and stitch across the top. On your pattern pieces, you'll actually see a lot of times that they will show the wrong side of the fabric either shaded darker or it'll have little lines across, and that's to help you with the construction of the garment. If you had something like a lap seam, typically they'll have you sew right side to wrong side, and then you'll fold over, and when you're done, the right side will be on the outside. But for our construction today, we're going to be working on right side to right side. Because when it comes to patterns, right side versus wrong side does not mean right and left of your pattern. You know, your patterns will have a front, back, top, bottom. Generally, they won't say right side or left side, because when you're cutting something, it's implied typically that the pattern is symmetrical, and when you're cutting 2 layers with the wrong sides together, you're making one pattern and then the reverse, and that's going to make your left and right side. If it's something that's asymmetrical, they'll typically tell you part A, part B, and part C, but you won't see left side, right side on most of your patterns. So if you see right side, again, it just means the side of the fabric that you want to see, the outside of the garment. So I'm ready to put my pattern pieces on my fabric. Again, I'll be cutting 2 pieces with each cut because I have doubled my fabric. And typically for something like this, I try to make sure that I line up the bottom hem so that they are on the same line of the fabric. That helps making sure that I'm matching my pattern repeat across the garment. Now for this one, I do need 4 pockets, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut 2 of the 4 using this piece of material in the middle, so I'm not wasting any material. And I can always save the leftover for another project. Now in full-size garments, usually you'll see people use weights or washers or things to hold the pieces flat to the fabric. Unfortunately, with the doll fabric, you're working with very small pieces, and that's just not going to be the easiest way to go about it. My suggestion is to pin the pieces to the fabric and then cut around the pattern pieces. For me, I like to use a long pin. I like to use a thin pin. When you get sewing pins, they come in a variety of different sizes. Quilters pins tend to be nice and long, but also sometimes they're a little bulky, a little thick. Because we're using thin material, sometimes they can punch a hole in your fabric that you'll notice later on. Or you might be dealing with a delicate fabric that you're really not supposed to be putting pins in to begin with. But you can usually find what's called a dressmaker or seamstress pin. It has a glass head, which means it won't melt if you do need to pin and press something with an iron. They're long, they're very sharp, So they'll go through a variety of materials without leaving holes or puncture marks or breaking threads in the fabric. Now, we don't want to put so many pins in it that we just pucker up and have a pin cushion for our pattern piece. But we want to make sure that we use enough pins that we can move the fabric and this little sandwich around to get into some of the smaller cuts without it shifting on the fabric. So I usually like to start with my corners, and I typically pin from inside towards the corner, because if a pattern is going to shift, it's going to shift in the direction that we're pinning. And then I'll usually go to the opposite corner, and this makes it nice and tight against the fabric. And I try to put them at an angle rather than all of the pins in a straight line, because when you move the fabric, the pins might slide and come off of your sandwich. So for pinning purposes, I usually go at sort of a 45-degree angle, and I try, if the fabric is especially delicate or it's something that you want to make sure that you don't have any holes in, like if you were using a vinyl or something like that that has a surface on it, you can put your pins inside that seam allowance. A good one is to make sure that you put some pins in your corners on your curves, because these are the areas that are more likely to stretch as you handle them and cut them. And we don't want this to stretch when we're cutting it, because then we may end up with a piece that's not true to our pattern piece. The nice part about cottons is they don't stretch, so generally they're where you cut, it's not going to be out of shape, so you don't have to put too many pins in place. Again, I've got a curve on this pocket. I want to make sure that the outside of the pocket stays to the grain, because I don't want the opening of the pocket to be able to stretch much, because I want that to kind of stay inside the seam. And sometimes your pattern piece may not be big enough, so when I go to cut this one out, sometimes you'll just have to shift that pin back and forth. Make sure that you're not hitting it with your scissors. And we're pinned, we're ready to cut. I always recommend a good pair of scissors. These are your fabric scissors. These are from Singer. They actually are a micro bladed edge, which you wouldn't be able to see on the camera, but if you looked very closely, you'll see that the edge of these scissors is actually little tiny serrations. And the fact that I like about these is those little serrations mean that that serrated edge grabs the fabric, and you'll get a nice clean cut, and you can cut through multiple layers usually with a good pair of scissors. But you want to make sure that these stay for cutting fabric. When you cut paper with scissors, it dulls them, and then you're going to end up just creating a mess when you try to cut your pattern. You'll have frayed edges and skips in the cut. Save the paper scissors for the paper, fabric scissors for fabric. Now that you have your rough cuts done, now we're going to actually work on fine cutting the pieces against the pattern. I usually do the curves first and then work on the straight edges. And like I said, you're just going to kind of walk your scissors around the edge of your pattern. So our pattern pieces are cut, and the next step is optional, but I highly recommend it for doll sewing. In a full-size garment, your seam allowance is usually a 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch. When you finish your garment and you wash your garment, sometimes there is some fraying on the seam, but you still have enough material before you reach your seam line or your stitching line that the garment is still going to hold. With doll sewing, you're typically working with a 1/4 inch, which seems to be kind of a general standard measurement for doll clothes, especially in this scale, or smaller, down to 1/8 of an inch. So you want to make sure that the fabric holds its integrity at that seam allowance, at that stitch line. So typically I like to apply some sort of fray checking material. Fray check is the most popular. It is kind of pricey, but a small bottle like this will go a very long way, a lot of projects, because you're just using a tiny amount of it. There are other ones such as Fray Block. This one is a little thicker. I've also seen people successfully use a little bit of white glue mixed with a small amount of water and just dipping their finger and running it along the edge of the fabric. What we're doing is we're sealing the fibers together on the edge of the fabric so that they don't fray with washing, or in the case of some things where we have to cut into the inseam, it doesn't come apart. Now, I will warn you that when using Fray Check or Fray Block, there are instructions on here. You do want to make sure that you use it in a well-ventilated area. It can get kind of fumey, especially if you're doing more than one item at a time. Also, the material itself, I can speak from experience. You want to have something protective on your work surface, because when this stuff is wet, it can damage the surface that it's on. Now, when you first get your bottle of Fray Check, it's actually going to be sealed. You'll have to use your scissors to clip off a little bit of the top. You may even have to use a pin occasionally to open up, because it will dry and clog the end. And you're just going to apply a small amount. It's just a little drop. And typically with the cotton fabric, it'll actually soak into the fibers quite quickly. And you just want to run along the very edge of your fabric. Especially any place like a pocket like this, where that raw edge is going to be in the garment. It's not going to be enclosed in another seam. We're ready to transfer our pattern markings onto our fabric, and I recommend what's called a water erasable marker. The nice thing about a water erasable marker is the marks stay on the fabric until you wash them or apply water and dilute it enough for it to disappear. That way, if you need to step away from your sewing project for a while and don't get back to it for a couple of days, your marks are still there. You haven't lost anything until you wash them out. There are other markers that fade over a period of time. You also have an option for dark fabric to use something like tailor's chalk or a marking pencil. But I really find this is the most expedient and most convenient way to mark my patterns. Now, usually when your pattern has a notch, it's to help you match a seam when you're sewing. And usually you'll see people will clip a small slit with their scissors, or they'll cut a notch in or cut a notch out. Because sometimes we're dealing with very small seam allowances, I don't like to cut them, Rather, I'll just go ahead and make a couple of dash marks where the center of the notch is. Just right there in that seam allowance. Now for this one, because we're putting pockets in a straight seam, just to make sure that the pockets match up, I'm gonna mark that notch. And I'm gonna go ahead and mark the stitch line for the waist. And I might mark the fold line for the hem. And again, I'm just kind of marking in that seam allowance where those need to be. Now the nice part is, remember, our pattern pieces are tracing paper, so we can see through them. So when I pull up the other side, remember when we cut in 2 layers, we have one that matches the pattern and one that's reversed. I can lay the pattern piece over it upside down, and I can still see to mark that half. For this particular pattern, we really want to mark that seam at the top and the waist, because when we fold that over, we want to make sure that those 2 stitch lines line up, because this will be our fold and will be the top of our waist, and we want to make sure that's straight. On our pockets, again, it's that straight edge, so to make sure that we match it up in the same spot, we're just going to go ahead and mark. Sometimes you have to check, make sure you've got the right side of the fabric on some of these light prints. And there's one more mark we need to make on our pattern pieces. Because remember, when we do our pocket on our instruction sheet, it actually shows that we're going to sew our side seam down to this point here. We're going to come back up and go around to make the pocket to here, and then continue down here. So what I have done on my pattern piece is I've actually taken a small hole punch and punched holes where those 2 marks are, and kind of clipped the pattern so I can see where the pocket stitching is going to continue. And that, I just literally just make a little dot, just kind of running it in a circle. Now the bottom one is the same, but I do want one up here so I know where to go back and follow the line of the pocket. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So we've got our pieces marked, and I usually keep the patterns nearby just for reference. And we're ready to start pinning our pieces. We've got a left and right front, a left and right back, and we're going to take this mark here. That mark corresponds to this mark. So we just line them up, and we're going to pin our pockets in place. Now, I like to put my pins so that they are inside from the seam allowance and that they run parallel to the stitching line. When we get to the sewing machine, you'll see that that means that the pins should be away from the needle where it's going to go, but easily accessible to pull them out as we sew along. And I find that when I do them perpendicular to the seam line, I have less movement of the pieces. They're more likely to stay where I need them to stay. And now for this particular pattern, our pockets go in the seam where the front and the back meet. So we're going to put half of our pocket pouch on each piece. And we are putting them right sides together. We had mentioned previous that in this case, the right side is going to be the side with the print. And so we have our pieces pinned, and we're ready to set up our sewing machine